Well, today's sermon is part of the lectionary portion in the New Testament. Last week, Aaron had to depart from the lectionary to give that special sermon about giving. But today, we're back in Mark. And Mark has an interesting way of telling stories. It's called sandwiching. In fact, 9 times in his gospel, he tells a story within a story. And we're being sandwiched here today. It starts out with the father of the little girl on the brink of death, requesting Jesus to heal her. The next thing we know is that there's a woman that's been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, being healed. And then we're back to the original story of the little girl. Each one of these sandwiches in Mark actually have their own little themes, but the theme today is faith. And this is actually the third of 9 sandwiches in Mark's gospel. But the key to the sandwich is always found in the middle. You know, when you're at home, the first thing you ask for is a peanut butter sandwich or a cheese sandwich. You never really ever hearing anybody say, well, I would like a rye bread with peanut butter in the middle. There's also a lot of things that are happening here in the background between these two stories. And without knowing a little Greek and growing up in that Jewish culture, they may be kind of hard to see. You have to understand that this part of Jesus' ministry is actually being held in Galilee. It's actually called the Galilean ministry. Galilee, if you remember, is to the north of Jerusalem. But when you think of Galilee, you normally think of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, the Sea of Galilee isn't a sea, it's actually a lake. And it's actually not all that big. It's only like 13 miles by 7 miles wide. But the reason it's called a sea is because the water can get so turned up from the atmosphere. The lake is actually very low, and there's some mountains above it. And when the air is coming off the mountains, it rushes down onto the sea, and there's this horrible storms that can develop down there. But there's actually quite a bit that actually takes place on the Sea of Galilee. Primarily on the west side, you've got quite a few Jewish people, living on that side. And then on the east side, you've got some Jewish people, but there's also a lot of Gentiles or non-Jews living there. Last week, the sermon should have been about Jesus leaving the west side and transversing across over there to the east side. It's when the big storm came up on the lake, and Jesus was sleeping in the back, and the disciples thought they were going to drown, so they went and woke him up. And that's when Jesus stood up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then he turned to him and said, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Upon arriving over there on the east side, Jesus is met over there by a demon, actually. He would have been a Gentile man, but Jesus actually has a discussion with the demons. And finding out that the demons called themselves Legion because there were many demons in this man, Jesus, of course, cleanses him by sending the legion of demons into the herd of pigs. Now, no good Jewish man or woman would have anything to do with pigs because they're considered unclean. But news went out, and the local people who owned the pigs came running over, and they asked Jesus to leave again. So he's back in the boat, and he's going back over to the west side. Well, he ends up getting back into this large crowd of people, and we don't know if it's the same large crowd that he tried to escape from, but he actually ended up not going inland, so to speak. He stayed by the sea, essentially for a quick getaway if it was needed. The reason for that was that the people in the area were coming to Jesus, of course, wanting to be healed, and they were pressing in so much on him that it was hard to move around. In fact, 3 chapters before, one reason why Jesus got into the boat away from the people was because he couldn't move. It'd be like us trying to, have somebody here in the middle and all of us trying to touch that one person while that one person was trying to get into the narthex. It'd actually be kind of humorous, so to speak, if that were to happen, but it was stifling. As this is all happening, news gets to Jairus, and he finds out and he hears that Jesus has, come to town. And so he takes off to find Jesus because his little girl, of course, is dying. What would Jairus have known about Jesus? If we just look at Mark's account, Jesus, at this point, he's already cast out demons on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and news of that spread all over Galilee. He had already healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law with a fever, and then that story got out, and they were bringing a whole bunch of people there to be healed at Peter's house. He had a leper come up to him and ask to be healed. And we also have the story of the paralytic that's being dropped down through the ceiling to Jesus. But after all those healings, we're starting to get some questioning from the Pharisees about Jesus and what he was up to. The complaints start coming in. He's starting to eat and dine with sinners and tax collectors. The complaints were that his disciples were not fasting properly. They were eating on the Sabbath. Complaints that he had healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And in Mark 3, it's the first time mentioned here that the Pharisees and the Herodians were looking for reasons to kill him. Jairus would have been well known about how the religious people of the day stood regarding Jesus, but he also knew of all the miracles and the healings that had taken place in that region. It looks like he chose the healing of his daughter over his standing in the religious community. But the question is, did he have faith? Well, he falls at Jesus' feet and he makes a strong request that Jesus come to his house and lay his hands on his daughter so that she might live. And of course, he agrees. Falling at the feet. The only people in the Gospels that fell at Jesus' feet to actually ask for something were people with unclean spirits, lepers, and Jairus. Peter did fall once, but he actually asked Jesus to leave because he was a sinful man. Now, Jesus is headed towards the house, but the big problem here, of course, is this crowd. It says here, the great crowd thronged him, which means little room for movement, pressed together, pressed upon, pressed in from all sides, crowding in against you. The strange thing about this touching thing is that this all started probably a year or so before. People were finding out that if they were touching Jesus, diseases were being healed. So everybody, wherever Jesus was, they were trying to get up there and touch him. This especially was happening back there in chapter 3. Now here comes the middle of the sandwich, the woman with the discharge. She's had this for 12 years, and that she had suffered under many physicians. Today we would have called her a doctor hopper. She also spent all that she had. And if you think about that, all that she had, and it took her 12 years, this woman did have some money. Then she was looking for a cure, of course, and nothing was helping her. In fact, the scripture says she became worse. And if she had gone to the synagogue and asked for help, there is a Jewish book out there called the Talmud. And it's got a lot of information on how to interpret the Old Testament with its rules and regulations. But there are a couple of recommendations for this problem. One, carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen rag around one's neck in summer and in a cotton rag in winter. The second cure, so to speak, was carrying barley corn from the dung of a white female donkey. Medicine has come a long way. You know, one of the things that we never really think about are all the rules and regulations that the Jewish people had to deal with. One is the thing about blood. Blood is not a good thing, but yet blood can be a good thing in the Old Testament. Women were ritually unclean once a month, and they were unable to go into the synagogue. In fact, Mary, after the birth of Jesus, was unclean for 7 days, and then she also had to remain home for 33 more days before a sacrifice was given on the 40th day. This lady would have been ritually unclean for 12 years. During that time, she was not supposed to touch anybody to avoid making them ritually unclean. If she ever had gone out in public, she was supposed to proclaim, "Unclean, unclean," so that people were aware of her and would avoid her. If she touched them, they were ritualistically unclean and would need to go through a cleansing process. Now, can you imagine doing that for 12 years? No church or synagogue. Living in Galilee, she would have heard about the stories and all the healing and the miracles of Jesus. Living there, she may have even seen some. But just like Jairus' daughter, she needed healing. But the crowd was large and pressing. She disregarded any of those rules, and she made her way to Jesus just to touch the hem of his clothes, thus making him unclean also. But obviously, this healing is different. The others were healed by Jesus at his touch, but this one was different in that he felt power leave him. This faith needed to be expressed verbally by her and heard by others. It's what Jairus needed to hear and see to increase his faith. That was for what was about to happen. She was a Jewish lady. He called her daughter, and that she was healed by her faith, healed of her disease. Jesus wants a confession as to who touched his garments, essentially with faith. After the story, Jesus says that her faith has made her well and to go in peace. And with that being said, some friend or relative arrived, and told the dad that his daughter had died. But Jesus overheard that, and he says, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be made well." That Greek word translated believe is the exact same Greek word for faith. So it could be translated, do not fear, have faith, and she will be well. Now, Jesus only allows the top 3 disciples, so to speak, Peter, James, and John, to follow him to the leader's house. Upon arriving there, enough time had passed that professional mourners were inside and outside mourning the death of the daughter by weeping and wailing loudly. The disciples, Jairus and his wife, and some professional mourners were now inside the house. Jesus sends the mourners out of the house, and then they all go into the room with the dead child. Remember, this sandwich is all about faith. Where is his faith at this point? Originally, this was about healing a sick child. She's now dead. Jairus saw the faith of the woman with the hemorrhage. He heard her story and the faith that she had in Jesus, and she was healed and freed of the disease and had peace. Jairus suffered a big blow to his faith when his friend came up and said, "Your daughter is dead." Jesus said, "Have faith." Jesus said, "Believe." The mourners thought she was dead. His wife was not in the room with the dead girl when they arrived. In faith, Jairus had brought Jesus and 3 of the disciples home to his home. Sending the non-believers out of the house, the 6 remaining walked in to the room, but 7 walked out. Faith in Jesus. The parents, for sure, I would think, and the disciples were immediately overcome with amazement. You would want to run out of the house and tell everybody what had happened. But Jesus told them that no one should know about this. This miracle, along with all the healings and the feeding of the thousands, the people were secondary to Jesus' primary reason for his coming. This all has to do with the gospel. And what is the gospel? The gospel is God's plan to reconcile man to himself. And that was to be accomplished by Jesus and what he was going to be doing actually on the cross. It's not the healing and the feeding of us. In the Old Testament, a perfect animal was to be sacrificed, innocent blood spilled for sin. No sacrifice we do or they did was completely innocent. They all bled and they died. Jesus also, the sacrifice, he bled and died. But he was raised, indicating that he was the perfect sacrifice. And that's the gospel. That's the good news. You need a sacrifice for sin. Either you're trying to do this on your own, trusting in yourself or in your good works, or your faith needs to put on him who was perfect, who bled, died, and was raised. Faith in Jesus, God's gospel of good news to us. Let's pray. Father, we're told in Matthew that the angel told Joseph and Mary that Mary would bear a son and that his name would be Jesus. for he would save his people from their sin. A sacrifice does that. Some of our faith needs building up. Some of us need to step out on this little faith. But yet all of us can say, I believe, help my unbelief. Amen. If you would turn your hymnals to 714, I know whom I have believed, but it'll also be on the screen behind.
I know not why God